In the quiet, pine-laced countryside of northern Minnesota, nestled among the sprawling woods and shimmering lakes, the Thompson family had carved out a life devoted to healing creatures that others had abandoned. For 15 years, Becky and Robert Thompson, licensed wildlife rehabilitators, had taken in foxes, raccoons, and even predatory mammals, nursing them back to health and releasing them when ready. But among all their rescues, one stood apart. Simba, a bobcat who had become much more than just an animal under their care. Simba was family. 3 years earlier, a forest ranger had brought them a tiny bobcat kitten, no more than a few weeks old, severely malnourished and clinging to life. His mother had been found dead nearby, and the kitten himself was dehydrated, fighting a respiratory infection, and with a malformed right hind leg, likely from birth, that would never fully function. "He's not a candidate for release," Dr. Michaels, their trusted veterinarian, had told them gravely. "Even with the best care, he won't survive in the wild. He'll need specialized care for life." Taking on Simba wasn't a decision the Thompsons made lightly. But when their son Ken, a boy of deep sensitivity and quiet strength, met the little bobcat for the first time, any hesitation melted away. Diagnosed with autism at age 3, and later with a primary immunodeficiency disorder that made him prone to serious infections, Ken had always struggled with sensory processing and social interactions. His world was one of carefully controlled routines and limited connections, until Simba. Ken had been having one of his difficult days when Simba arrived, tucked away in his quiet corner, rocking gently with headphones on to block out the world. But the soft, desperate mews of the kitten had pierced through Ken's cocoon. To everyone's surprise, Ken had removed his headphones, approached the frightened creature, and whispered, "He's scared, like me sometimes." From that moment, an extraordinary bond was forged. Simba, under the family's care, grew strong. Yet from the beginning, it was clear that he had an uncanny connection to Ken. When Ken became overwhelmed, Simba would silently curl beside him, his purring a steady, calming force. Even more astonishing, Simba seemed to sense when Ken's health was faltering, pacing nervously and calling out in strange vocalizations that soon became the family's early warning system. Together, Ken and Simba had found something precious: understanding, comfort, and love that transcended words. But on one spring morning, as dawn's first light filtered through the towering pines, everything changed. Becky stood in the kitchen, cradling her coffee, listening for the soft patting of paws that always accompanied her mornings. But there was only silence. "Robert," she called, a note of unease creeping into her voice. Her husband, cooking breakfast for 10-year-old Ken, turned at the sound of her concern. "Have you seen Simba this morning?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Robert frowned, setting down a spatula. "Not since last night. Maybe check the sunroom? He loves to watch the birds at sunrise." But the sunroom was empty. So was his perch by the living room window. Becky's unease deepened as she checked all his usual hiding spots: under the couch, behind the old armchair, even inside the linen closet he sometimes snuck into. Then she saw it: the back door, slightly ajar, swaying gently in the morning breeze. The door that led to their large fenced backyard, and beyond that, the endless woods. "The door!" she whispered, panic rising in her chest. "Robert, I think Simba got out." Robert was already grabbing his boots. "Stay with Ken," he said firmly. "I'll go look for him." But fate was faster than Robert's search. Just as he was about to step outside, the phone rang. Becky snatched it up, hoping against hope for good news. "Hello?" Her face went pale as she listened, her hand trembling. "Yes, that's our address. Yes, he belongs to us. We have all the proper licensing. Oh God, is he?" "Yes, we'll be right there." She hung up, turning to Robert with eyes wide in shock. "That was Mrs. Hendrick," Becky said, her voice breaking. 2 miles down the road. Simba's been hit by a car. She recognized him from his tag. He's alive, but she says, it looks bad." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Becky grabbed her purse and keys as Robert went to speak to Ken. In soft, careful words, Robert explained to Ken that Simba had gotten out and was hurt. Ken, who usually struggled with sudden changes in routine, simply stood, his face pale but determined. "Simba needs me," was all he said. The drive to the Hendrick property felt endless, though it took only 10 minutes. As they pulled up, Becky's heart clenched at the sight of Mrs. Hendrick standing beside a small, motionless form in the grass. Simba. His coat, once sleek and golden, was matted with blood. His chest rose and fell in painful, shallow breaths. His right hind leg, the bad one, was twisted at an unnatural angle, and both front paws were bloodied and torn. Ken let out a small, wounded sound, but to Becky's surprise, he didn't cry. He walked straight to Simba's side, knelt beside him, and spoke gently. "It's okay, Simba. We're going to help you. You helped me. Now it's my turn." As if hearing Ken's voice stirred something deep inside, Simba opened his eyes, dull but aware, and let out a faint, rasping sound. Not quite a purr, but something close. "We need to get him to Dr. Michaels fast," Robert said, unrolling an emergency blanket. Together, he and Becky carefully lifted Simba, Ken staying close, whispering softly the whole time. At the veterinary clinic, Dr. Michaels was waiting, his face grim as he examined the battered bobcat. "Multiple fractures in both front limbs," he murmured, his fingers probing gently. "The right hind leg, a compound fracture. And with that pre-existing issue, this is serious, very serious. Massive soft tissue trauma. His paw pads are torn up too. And," he hesitated, "I need to be honest. Even with surgery and months of rehab, he may never regain full mobility. And the cost..." Becky's voice broke as she asked, "Are you saying we should put him down?" Dr. Michaels met her gaze, his own eyes full of sadness. "It may be the kindest option." But before anyone could speak, Ken stood up, small but steady, his voice clear in a way Becky had rarely heard. "No." Everyone turned to look at him. "Simba wouldn't give up on me," Ken said, tears sliding down his cheeks. "I'm not giving up on him." And then something incredible happened. Despite the sedation and his terrible injuries, Simba stirred. His eyes opened wider, and with obvious pain he tried to move, scrabbling weakly toward Ken. Dr. Michael's eyes widened in disbelief. "He shouldn't even be awake, let alone moving." Lisa, one of the vet techs, gently restrained Simba to prevent him from falling off the table, her own eyes full of tears. "I know someone who might help," she said suddenly. "My sister works with Dr. Noel Carter in Minneapolis. He specializes in exotic animal surgery. If anyone can give Simba a chance, it's him." Dr. Michaels hesitated, then nodded. "Carter's good, but he's hours away, and the cost will be..." "We'll find a way," Robert said firmly. "We owe it to Simba, and to Ken." Becky looked from her husband to her son, then down at Simba's battered body. "Let's do it," she whispered. With that, the fight for Simba's life had only just begun. The decision was made, and everything moved quickly after that. Dr. Michaels, though grim, acted with his usual efficiency, stabilizing Simba for transport. He carefully applied temporary splints to the broken limbs, administering pain medication and fluids to keep him stable for the long drive ahead. Simba, sedated but still conscious enough to sense the care being given, lay limply on the table, his golden eyes half-lidded with exhaustion and pain. Becky and Robert could barely speak as they prepared to leave, their hearts heavy with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Ken, though still silent, held a quiet strength that seemed to reassure them both. He didn't cry. He didn't ask questions. He just stood by his parents, his eyes fixed on Simba. "We need to get to Dr. Carter's clinic," Becky said, swallowing her fear. "Now!" Lisa, the tech who had suggested Dr. Carter, made a quick call to her sister. Within minutes, an emergency consultation was arranged, and the Thompsons set out on a 3-hour journey to Minneapolis. The drive felt like an eternity. Every bump in the road made Becky's stomach lurch with dread, but she couldn't bear the thought of Simba suffering without a chance. Keen, sitting quietly in the back seat beside the carrier, refused to leave Simba's side, his small hand resting gently on the top of the crate. Occasionally, he would whisper, soft and tender, "It's okay, Simba. We're going to get through this. I'm right here." Ken, though his voice was barely above a whisper, continued to speak his assurances. It was as if, despite everything, his bond with Simba had become the strongest thing in the world. Becky and Robert exchanged glances in the rearview mirror, both wondering, with a mix of awe and fear, just how deep the connection between the boy and the bobcat truly ran. Finally, after what felt like hours of tension and quiet whispers, they arrived at the Advanced Veterinary Surgical Center in Minneapolis. The building was a stark contrast to the rural, homely feel of their own clinic. The gleaming glass and steel exterior reflected the fading evening light, and inside the air hummed with the sound of high-tech machinery and quiet conversation. Dr. Carter, a tall man with silvery hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, was waiting outside. "You must be the Thompsons," he said, shaking their hands. "Lisa's sister called ahead. Let's get Simba inside and start assessing right away." The surgery center was like something out of a human hospital. The staff moved with precision, setting up imaging equipment, preparing X-ray machines, and securing Simba's fragile body for a full evaluation. As they wheeled Simba into the back of the clinic, Becky and Robert sat down in a sterile consultation room, both of them exhausted and filled with worry. Ken remained remarkably still, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes focused as though he could will Simba through this. The room was quiet except for the soft murmur of staff moving about and the occasional beep of machines. 2 hours later, Dr. Carter finally entered, his face serious but not without hope. "Simba's injuries are extensive," he began, spreading out a series of images on the table in front of them. "As expected, both front limbs have multiple fractures. His right hind leg is a complex compound fracture. But there's good news, no significant internal damage. His spine is intact, and there doesn't appear to be any internal bleeding. His major organs are functioning well, which means we have something to work with." Becky's heart skipped a beat. That was a glimmer of hope. Dr. Carter continued, "The next step will involve multiple surgeries. We'll need to reconstruct the bones in his hind leg with pins and bone grafts. The front limbs will also need to be surgically repaired. It's going to be a long road, possibly 6 months or more, and there's no guarantee he'll regain full mobility. But he could still have a good quality of life." Becky nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. "What about the cost?" Dr. Carter gave a small, understanding smile. "I know this is a lot to take in. We have a foundation that works with extraordinary cases like Simba's, animals with deep bonds to their families. It won't cover everything, but it could help offset some of the costs." Robert exhaled slowly, glancing at Becky. "We'll find a way," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "We owe it to Simba, and to Ken." Ken, who had been unusually quiet throughout the discussion, stood up. "Simba is family. We don't leave family behind." The words, so simple yet filled with unwavering resolve, struck both Becky and Robert deeply. Their son, who had often struggled to speak up in class or assert himself in social situations, was showing a determination that left them both in awe. Dr. Carter nodded, his eyes filled with admiration. "It seems you already have a great deal of strength in this family. Let's give Simba that chance." With that, the decision was made, and the surgery began. Simba was carefully stabilized for transport, and Dr. Carter worked through the night. The surgery was long and complicated, lasting nearly 6 hours, but by the time morning came, Simba had made it through. The next 2 days passed in a blur. Becky and Robert checked into a nearby hotel, taking shifts to be with Simba and keep vigil over their beloved companion. Ken, however, refused to leave the clinic. He sat in the waiting area, his small form hunched over his tablet, watching the progress of Simba's recovery through video calls, asking the staff for updates. His voice, though soft, was steady. Every so often, Becky or Robert would sit with him, offering quiet words of comfort, but Ken was unshakable. On the second day, Simba was stable enough to receive visitors, and Ken was allowed to see his friend. The sight of the once powerful bobcat now resting in a special enclosure, surrounded by tubes and monitors, was a stark contrast to the Simba Ken had known. Yet despite the sadness, Ken's resolve never wavered. "Hi, Simba," Ken whispered, leaning close to the mesh front of the enclosure. "It's me, Ken. You're going to be okay. The doctors are helping you and I'm here. I'm not leaving you." To everyone's surprise, Simba's monitors shifted. His heart rate, which had been erratic and elevated, began to slow. One ear twitched. Then, as though sensing the familiar voice, Simba's golden eyes focused on Ken. "Would you look at that?" the nurse whispered to Becky. "He knows Ken is here." It was a small miracle, but it gave the Thompsons more hope than they had ever dared to imagine. The next 2 weeks were filled with surgeries in progress. Simba underwent 2 more procedures, one to reconstruct his hind leg and another to address his paw pads. Through it all, Ken stayed by his side, unwavering. And as Simba slowly recovered, something remarkable happened. The bond between Ken and Simba, already extraordinary, deepened further. Simba began to improve, showing signs of his old self, determined, resilient, and always by Ken's side when he needed him most. The weeks that followed Simba's surgeries were filled with a quiet, determined rhythm. The Thompson family had settled into a new routine, one that balanced hope with uncertainty. Every day brought small victories and setbacks. Progress was slow, but it was progress nonetheless. Ken, who had never hesitated in his devotion to Simba, became an integral part of the healing process. Each day, he would arrive at the clinic with his parents, bringing comfort to the Bobcat in ways that no one else could. As Simba's recovery continued, it became clear that his bond with Ken was the catalyst for his healing. Simba, once a wild creature that had lived only on instinct and the forces of nature, had adapted to his new life in ways no one could have predicted. Despite the severe trauma to his body, he still retained his wild spirit. His eyes remained bright and alert, though his once graceful movements were now slow and careful. But as his limbs healed, Simba became more mobile. The physical therapy, though grueling, was working, and his muscles began to regain strength. It wasn't the same as before, but Simba had learned to adapt to his new body, just as he had adapted to life with the Thompsons. Ken's involvement in Simba's physical therapy became crucial. With the help of the clinic's nurses, he learned exercises designed to help Simba rebuild strength. He would guide Simba through stretches, gently assisting him as the Bobcat moved his limbs. Simba, though clearly in pain at times, responded with an uncanny patience for the boy who had always been there for him. One afternoon, after several weeks of intensive therapy, Simba took his first few halting steps on his own. The movement was slow, the limp in his hind legs still pronounced, but it was a victory, a sign that the months of grueling recovery were beginning to pay off. Ken's face lit up with pride as he watched Simba make his way across the room, his small hand resting on the Bobcat's back for reassurance. "You did it, Simba," Ken whispered, his voice soft but full of wonder. "You're getting stronger." The rest of the staff at the clinic shared in the joy of the moment. Even Dr. Carter, who had initially been cautious about Simba's chances, allowed himself a small smile of approval. "Simba's made remarkable progress," Dr. Carter said, his voice filled with admiration. "I have to say, I didn't expect this level of resilience. Most animals in his condition would have given up by now. But he's still fighting. He wants to be with you, Ken." Ken nodded, his eyes never leaving Simba as the Bobcat gingerly padded across the floor. "I know. I'll never give up on him." But the road to full recovery was not without its challenges. 3 months into treatment, Simba developed an infection in his right hind leg where the bone graft had been placed. The infection threatened to set back all the progress they had made, and for several tense days the veterinary team fought to bring it under control. Ken once again proved to be an invaluable presence. He insisted on visiting Simba during this difficult time, believing, as he had before, that his presence would make a difference. "I can feel it," he said quietly to his parents. "Simba's scared. He needs me there." Robert and Becky, both skeptical at first, were moved by Ken's insistence. They agreed to make the drive back to Minneapolis, though they worried that the infection could undo everything they had fought for. When they arrived at the clinic, they found Simba's condition still precarious. He lay quietly in his enclosure, his body fragile and weakened by the infection. But as soon as Ken stepped into the room, Simba's head turned, and his golden eyes locked on the boy. "Hi, Simba," Ken said, his voice soft but steady. "I'm here. You're going to be okay. We'll get through this." It was then that something extraordinary happened. Simba, despite his pain and the sedative that should have kept him still, lifted his head and seemed to respond. His heart rate, which had been elevated, began to stabilize. One of his ears twitched as if seeking out the source of Ken's voice. Becky and Robert stood in stunned silence, watching the interaction between Ken and Simba. They had both believed that Simba's recovery was purely physical. that his body needed time to heal. But in that moment, it became clear that the bond between the boy and the bobcat was something deeper. It wasn't just about the physical healing, it was about something intangible, a connection that transcended the limits of medicine. Ken's quiet reassurance seemed to work. Over the next few days, Simba's condition improved, the infection gradually receding under the care of the clinic's staff and the strength of the bond between the two. By the time Simba reached the 6-month mark of his recovery, he was walking more confidently, though his movements were still deliberate and careful. His coat, once patched and ragged from the trauma, was growing back. He was regaining some of his former strength, and his golden eyes, always full of intelligence, sparkled with life again. Yet despite the progress, it was clear that Simba would never be the same as he had been before the accident. His right hind leg would always be weaker than the other, and he would have to live with the scars of his ordeal. But he was still a bobcat, wild, independent, and above all, resilient. One evening, as the sun began to set over the Minnesota woods, the Thompsons sat in their living room, watching as Simba curled up beside Ken by the window. The boy, now more confident in his own abilities, had grown into his role as Simba's caretaker. The bobcat, despite his injuries, had resumed his protective role as Ken's guardian, always there when the boy needed him most. Becky watched them, a sense of peace settling over her. She had seen her son grow in ways she never thought possible. Simba's accident and recovery had changed them all, drawing them closer as a family and deepening the bond between human and animal in a way that words couldn't fully express. Ken, his hand resting gently on Simba's back, looked up at his mother. "Simba still likes to watch the birds, even though he can't chase them anymore," he said softly, a hint of sadness in his voice. Becky smiled, reaching out to gently stroke Simba's head. "I think he's happy just being here with you." Ken nodded, his eyes focused on Simba. "We take care of each other, don't we?" Becky's heart swelled with emotion as she watched them together. "Yes," she whispered, "that's what family does." And in that moment, as Simba leaned into the touch and Ken continued to speak to him in soft, reassuring tones, it became clear to Becky that the bond they had formed, the connection between them all, was something extraordinary, something that would last no matter what challenges the future held. Simba, though no longer the same as he had been before, had proven that there was no limit to the strength of love. And in his own way, he had healed not just himself, but the Thompsons as well. 1 year after the accident, the Thompson family held a quiet celebration in honor of Simba's recovery. It was a small gathering, just the family and a few close friends, but the joy in the air was palpable. The bobcat, now fully adapted to his new reality, moved through the house with careful grace. His gait was distinct, his steps deliberate, but there was a strength in his movement, a strength that spoke to the battles he had fought and overcome. His coat, once patchy from his ordeal, had grown back in places, though there were still patches where the fur had never quite returned to its former glory. His body, thinner than it had been before the accident, now bore the scars of his survival. But his golden eyes, the eyes that had seen the harshness of the world and survived, still sparkled with life and intelligence. Ken, too, had changed. The shy, reserved boy who had once struggled to communicate and connect with the world had found a new sense of confidence. He had grown not just in his relationship with Simba, but in his own understanding of himself. His bond with the bobcat had taught him patience, resilience, and most importantly, the power of love. Now, as Ken sat on the window seat with Simba curled beside him, they watched the evening sky transform into hues of gold and amber. The trees outside swayed gently in the evening breeze, the world alive with the sounds of nature. Becky and Robert watched from the doorway, their hearts full. The journey they had taken over the past year had been one of hardship and heartache, but also one of profound growth. They had seen their son step into his own, and they had seen Simba, once a broken creature, emerge stronger, both physically and emotionally, with a bond to their family that had only deepened with time. Simba's recovery was not just a physical journey, but a spiritual one as well. The bobcat had shown them all that survival wasn't just about overcoming pain and adversity. It was about the connections we form with others. It was about trust, compassion, and the unbreakable ties that bind us together, whether we are human or animal. "Dinner's almost ready," Becky called softly, reluctant to break the peaceful scene. Ken didn't move. His hand rested gently on Simba's back, the two of them a perfect picture of companionship. "We're just watching the bird," Ken said, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Simba still likes to watch the birds, even though he can't chase them anymore. Becky smiled as she walked over to them, gently stroking Simba's head. "I think he's happy just being here with you." Ken nodded, his gaze soft, as he looked down at the bobcat. "He's my family." Becky sat down beside them, her heart full of love for her son and for the creature who had become an inseparable part of their lives. She looked at Robert, and without words they both understood. They had been through so much together. A year ago they had feared they might lose Simba. They had fought for his life, poured everything they had into his recovery, and in the end, they had gained so much more than they had ever expected. Simba was family, and so was Ken. The Thompson family had grown stronger, not in spite of the hardships they faced, but because of them. They had learned in ways they could never have imagined that love was the most powerful force in the world. More powerful than fear, more powerful than pain, more powerful than any obstacle. And with love, anything was possible. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the house, the family sat together, a picture of quiet contentment. Simba, despite his scars and limitations, was home. Ken was whole in a way he had never been before. And Becky and Robert, watching their son with the bobcat who had helped him find his voice, knew that they had all been part of something truly extraordinary. Lessons from the story: unbreakable bonds. The central lesson of Simba's story is the power of unbreakable bonds. Whether between a boy and a wild animal, or between humans and their loved ones, these connections transcend circumstances and challenges. The bond between Ken and Simba wasn't just about caregiving, it was a mutual relationship of trust and love that helped them both heal. Love has the power to bridge the gaps between species, and it has the ability to heal even the deepest wounds. Resilience and adaptation. Simba's journey highlights the resilience that all creatures, human or animal, possess. Despite the severe injuries and limitations he faced, Simba adapted to his new life. His determination to survive and to stay connected to his family showed that even in the face of great adversity, the will to live and the will to adapt can lead to recovery. Resilience is not about returning to the way things were, but about moving forward in new and unexpected ways. Healing through compassion. The story shows that healing is not just a physical process, but an emotional and spiritual one. Simba's recovery wasn't solely dependent on medical treatments. It was his connection with Ken and the Thompsons' unyielding compassion that played a crucial role in his healing. Compassion is a powerful force that can inspire incredible strength, and sometimes the act of caring for another is what gives us the strength to overcome our own struggles. The power of trust. The relationship between Ken and Simba was built on trust. Ken trusted Simba to be there when he was scared or sick, and Simba trusted Ken to help him through his own pain and recovery. Trust is the foundation of any meaningful relationship, and it allows both parties to feel safe enough to be vulnerable. Simba's ability to trust his family and to seek comfort from Ken during his darkest moments was a testament to the transformative power of trust. The importance of perseverance. Through the Thompsons' journey, we see the importance of perseverance. The road to recovery for Simba was long and fraught with obstacles, but the Thompsons never gave up. Even when the path seemed impossible, they kept fighting for their beloved bobcat. Perseverance doesn't guarantee a perfect outcome, but it ensures that you give your best effort and leave no room for regret. The healing power of love. Ultimately, the story teaches us that love is the most powerful force in the world. It heals, it strengthens, and it transforms. Whether it's the love between Ken and Simba, or the love the Thompsons shared as a family, love was the force that carried them through. When we are driven by love, we find the strength to face challenges, heal from wounds, and create unbreakable connections with others. In summary, Simba's story reminds us that love, trust, compassion, and resilience are the key ingredients to overcoming adversity. It is through these qualities that we truly heal and grow.